How Israel's intelligence failed on October 7th inside the Mossad collapse. 6:29 a.m., October 7th, 2023. In a military observation post in southern Israel, a 20-year-old soldier named Noah is watching her screens. She monitors the Gaza border every day. She has been raising alarms about unusual Hamas training exercises for months. Her superiors told her she was overthinking it. At 6:30 a.m., the sky tears open. 3,000 rockets launch simultaneously from Gaza. 29 gaps are blown in the border fence at the same moment. 3,000 Hamas fighters pour into Israel. The military response? It will take hours. In some kibbutzim, it will take 20 hours. 1,200 people will be killed that day, the deadliest single day in Israeli history, the deadliest massacre of Jewish people since the Holocaust. Here is the part that will make you sick. Israel had the plans in writing for 5 years. Chapter 1. The machine that was supposed to see everything. Israel built the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the world. Mossad, the external spy agency, is legendary. It assassinated nuclear scientists in Iran. It tracked Nazi war criminals to South America. It ran agents inside hostile governments for decades. Shin Bet, the internal security service, penetrated Palestinian militant organizations so deeply that for years it seemed like Hamas could barely sneeze without Israel knowing about it. And then there was Unit 8200, Israel's Signals Intelligence Unit, their version of the NSA, but proportionally far larger for a country of 9 million people. Unit 8200 used AI-driven systems that seemed to create an all-seeing, all-hearing surveillance network. Every phone call, every text message, every radio signal in and out of Gaza, monitored, analyzed, processed. Israel spent billions building a physical border around Gaza, not just a fence, a smart fence, cameras, motion sensors, underground sensors, surveillance balloons floating high above the strip, their cameras capturing every inch of the border, day and night. Billions of dollars invested in high-tech defenses were believed to be enough to stop any attack. The machine was perfect. The machine could not fail. This is what the people running the machine believed. They were wrong in ways that will take generations to fully understand. Chapter 2. The blueprint that nobody believed. Hamas called it the Walls of Jericho. It was a battle plan, a detailed, specific, operational blueprint for breaching the Israel-Gaza border, destroying military outposts, overrunning kibbutzim, and taking hostages. Israeli intelligence became aware of the Walls of Jericho plan in 2 different iterations, in 2018 and again in 2022. Let that sink in. Israel had Hamas invasion plan in 2018, 5 years before October 7th. In July 2022, the Gaza Division's intelligence officer gave a briefing to senior IDF leaders entitled The Mass Invasion Plan of Hamas. The presentation laid out a plan of attack exactly like the one Hamas launched on October 7th and assessed this invasion constitutes the gravest threat that IDF forces are facing in the defense of Israel. Senior officials heard this briefing. They considered Hamas incapable of actually executing it. They took no action, no reinforcements, no defensive upgrades, no escalated surveillance, no change in posture, nothing. The producers of Fauda, a globally successful Netflix drama about Israeli undercover operatives, had actually rejected a script where Hamas fighters stormed the fence, calling it implausible. This was the consensus reality inside Israeli intelligence and culture. Hamas storming the fence wasn't a scenario worth seriously planning for. It was fiction, except Hamas was rehearsing it in broad daylight. Chapter 3. The Woman Who Saw It Coming. Her name has not been fully made public. She was a young female analyst in an IDF observation unit stationed near the Gaza border. For months in 2023, she watched something that disturbed her deeply. Hamas fighters in Gaza were conducting training exercises on a mock scale, a mock Israeli kibbutz, replica streets, replica houses. They were practicing room-by-room assault. They were practicing how to move through a community. They were practicing how to take people from their beds. An intelligence unit observed a rehearsal exercise in Gaza City and drew the document and the exercise together to correctly assess the relevance of both. The analyst suggested to her superiors that the rehearsal was not for a raid, but an invasion. She was dismissed. Young women soldiers at observation centers reported Hamas's intensified training on models of an Israeli kibbutz and an Israeli tank. There were also reports of individual operators at Unit 8200 who raised similar indicators and were similarly ignored. This is important. This is not a single analyst failing to see something. This is a pattern of people at the ground level, the people with eyes on the target every day, raising alarms and being told to stand down by people at higher levels who had already decided on an answer. The answer was, Hamas is deterred. No amount of evidence was going to change that conclusion.
Chapter 4. The Conception. In Israeli intelligence terminology, there is a word for the catastrophic mental model that caused the failure. They call it the conception. The prevailing belief was that Hamas was uninterested in conflict and was instead focused on governing Gaza. As recently as June 2023, 4 months before October 7th, Prime Minister Netanyahu told party leaders he was convinced Hamas was deterred from undertaking a significant attack. This wasn't arrogance exactly. It had a rational basis. At first, Hamas had stayed out of 2 significant rounds of fighting in 2022 and 2023. When Israel struck Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, Hamas did not respond. Intelligence leaders interpreted this pattern as confirmation. Hamas didn't want a war. Hamas was busy governing. Hamas was deterred. The prevailing belief was reaffirmed when Hamas chose twice to stay out of the fighting, leading decision-makers to see this as confirmation that Hamas was deterred and had no incentive to launch a major confrontation. What nobody considered seriously enough was the alternative explanation. Hamas wasn't standing down because it was deterred. Hamas was standing down because it was waiting, preserving its capabilities, rehearsing, preparing, staying quiet precisely to avoid the kind of intelligence surge that would expose what it was building. Hamas was not afraid of Israel's response. Hamas was managing it. Chapter 5. The money problem nobody solved. Here is one of the most extraordinary details of the October 7th failure. Israel, specifically the Netanyahu government, had been actively facilitating the transfer of hundreds of millions of dollars from Qatar to Hamas. The logic was simple. A Hamas that had money to pay salaries, run schools, and keep the lights on in Gaza was a Hamas that had reasons not to start a war. Economic stability equals deterrence. Give them enough to govern, they won't have the energy to fight. Even Mossad Director David Barnea expressed concern in 2021 that Hamas was diverting the Qatari money to military capabilities. His predecessor acknowledged Israel had few insights into how Hamas actually used the funds. The concern was noted. It was not acted upon. The transfers continued. The Shin Bet's investigation concluded that Israel's policy of calm with Hamas allowed for the group's massive military buildup, and that Qatar's money was being diverted to Hamas's military capabilities. Israel wasn't just failing to see the threat. Israel was in part financing it. This is the detail that haunts every serious post-mortem of October 7th.
Chapter 6. The Warnings from Outside. It was not only Israeli analysts raising alarms. Egyptian intelligence director Abbas Kamel personally called Prime Minister Netanyahu in late September 2023 to warn that Hamas was planning something unusual, a terrible operation, a head of state calling directly with a specific warning days before the attack. Netanyahu was reportedly not very very interested in the report, as the IDF was focused principally on violence in the West Bank at the time. Egypt warned Israel. Israel nodded and moved on. And then the night before, at 3:03 a.m. on October 7th, the Shin Bet alerted security branches and the Prime Minister's National Security Council that several Hamas brigades were activating their networks of cell phones, saying it could point to Hamas offensive activity. 45 SIM cards were gradually activated from the evening of October 5th until 2 hours before the attack, but agents dismissed it because a similar number of SIM cards had been activated during the same period 1 year before. The pattern matched a previous non-event, so it was classified as another non-event. At 4:30 a.m., the Shin Bet chief briefed deputies about the worrying signs, and a team of forces was sent to Israel's south to prepare for a possible infiltration, but it was not sufficient to thwart the large-scale attack. 2 hours before 3,000 fighters crossed the border, Israel's intelligence chief knew something was wrong. 2 hours, and still. Chapter 7. The technology trap. There is a harder, deeper failure underneath all of this. Israel's increased reliance on world-leading technical intelligence capabilities, including AI associated with Unit 8200, seemingly created an all-seeing, all-hearing panopticon that reduced reliance on human intelligence. This is the technology trap. When your surveillance system is sophisticated enough, you start to believe it is complete. You start to trust the absence of alarm as proof that there is nothing to alarm about. But the Shin Bet's own investigation revealed huge gaps in the recruitment and operation of human agents in Gaza. Human intelligence, is slow, it is expensive, it is messy. It requires building relationships inside enemy organizations over years, sometimes decades. It requires accepting moral complexity. It cannot be scaled with a budget increase the way technical surveillance can. A Shin Bet human source from Gaza warned of an attack in the week after Yom Kippur, the last week of September 2023. Although the source was deemed credible, Shin Bet managers dismissed the report. They had a human source inside Gaza telling them an attack was coming. They dismissed it because the conception said otherwise, because the technology hadn't confirmed it, because a human voice in a world of AI surveillance and billion-dollar sensor networks had become the least trusted form of intelligence. The sensors deployed along the border were well recognized by Hamas's intelligence gathering, and since they were remote-controlled, they were vulnerable to attack by simple means: explosive devices or hand grenades dropped from small drones. With 3 of the observation balloons down for various reasons, the IDF was easier to blind on the day of the attack. The billion-dollar surveillance border was taken down with grenades and consumer drones. Chapter 8. The political dimension. Intelligence does not exist in a vacuum. It exists inside political systems, and in 2023, Israel's political system was tearing itself apart. The Netanyahu government was attempting to overhaul the country's judiciary, a deeply divisive move that triggered mass protests across Israel for months. Military reservists threatened not to show up for duty. Former security officials warned publicly that the political crisis was eroding Israel's deterrence. Both former senior security officials and a leading national security think tank cautioned between the spring and summer of 2023 that the political crisis triggered by the government's attempted judicial reform could erode Israel's regional deterrence and prompt Israel's enemies to seek renewed confrontation. Hamas was watching this. The fracturing of Israel's society was one of the factors that made October 7th seem like the right right moment to strike. But the political dimension runs deeper than the protests. Intelligence analysts did identify a clear shift in Hamas's modus operandi that pointed to a potential game-changing attack, but these assessments never carried sufficient weight to shift prevailing assumptions in a hierarchical structure where policy priorities set by the Prime Minister's office remained fixed. The intelligence hierarchy deferred upward. The political hierarchy had already decided. Hamas was deterred. Hamas was manageable. The Qatari money was working. Nobody at the top wanted to hear that the entire strategic premise was wrong. The October 7th massacre demonstrated that the system had developed a degree of resistance to internal criticism. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. Shin Bet chief Ronan Bar said in a statement that if Shin Bet had acted differently in the years leading up to the attack and on the night of the attack, the massacre would have been prevented. He added that as the head of the organization, I will carry this heavy burden on my shoulders for the rest of my life. The Israeli military's own investigation highlighted gaps in intelligence gathering, flawed assumptions about Hamas, and systemic failures in the IDF's preparedness and response. Netanyahu deflected responsibility. His office accused the Shin Bet chief of failing to wake him on the night of the attack. The Shin Bet fired back that the political leadership's own decisions, including the Qatari money transfers and the visits to the Al-Aqsa complex in Jerusalem that inflamed tensions, were contributing factors. The blame ricochets. The political and security establishments point at each other. Meanwhile, the Israeli response that followed has killed tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza. The hostages, 251 taken on October 7th, became the central crisis of Israeli national life. Some were returned through negotiated deals. Others remain missing. The young analyst who kept raising the alarm before October 7th, she was right about everything. Her reward was being ignored until it was too late.
History has a name for what happened on October 7th. It is called a strategic surprise, and it has happened before. Pearl Harbor, 1941. America had intercepted Japanese communications. Analysts raised warnings. They were not actioned in time. Yom Kippur, 1973. Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. Intelligence had warnings. The conception, then too, a firm belief that Egypt would not attack, overrode them. The question that haunts the Israeli public is whether the murderous Hamas attack might have been prevented had the lessons of the past been properly implemented. The answer, based on everything we now know, is yes. The plans existed. The warnings existed. The human source existed. The analyst who saw the rehearsal existed. The Egyptian intelligence director made the phone call. The information was there. What failed was not the collection of intelligence. What failed was the willingness to believe what the intelligence was saying, because believing it meant admitting that the entire strategic framework of the past decade was built on a lie. Hamas was not deterred. Hamas was never deterred. Hamas was waiting.